Hello, and welcome to the first video in a new series called Understanding VFX. In this series, we will be breaking down effects in modern games and learning how to create VFX just like the ones you see in your favorite games. As a disclaimer, this series is not trying to say that making these effects is easy, as it's far easier for us to look at something that someone else has already made and try to recreate it. A lot of work from a lot of talented artists goes into each of these effects, which I then spend a fraction of that amount of work to replicate and record a video on, which itself is a fraction of the length of the time I spent figuring it out myself. I'm also not condoning anyone replicating the effects of others for use in their own commercial products. Simply recreating the work of another and selling it as your own is plagiarism, just as it would be in any other medium. The goal here is to understand the effect so that we can learn how to use similar techniques to create our very own effects. As a result, I won't be recreating most of the effects exactly. I will merely be covering the basics required to create the effect, not all the detail work. I also cannot possibly know all the steps they used, so these are just my best guesses as to how these effects are created. Now that we've got all the fun stuff out of the way, let's take a look at what we'll be learning about in this video. The first effect that we're going to be covering in this series is from Kingdom Hearts 3. And if you haven't seen this game, it is absolutely gorgeous. If you have seen it, you don't need me to tell you that. There are so many great visual effects in this game, from particle effects, just splashing all over the place, fireworks and water, to really cool material effects, like characters fizzling in, and also the effect that we're going to cover today, which is a depth faking effect on a stained glass floor. But, I might come back to this game in the future to do some more of the cool effects from it once I've had a chance to play this game for myself. I haven't actually played it. Me getting the idea from this, for doing this from this game, is actually from somebody else who makes some cool tutorials in Unreal Engine 4 named Deviver. I hope I'm saying that right. He's got a Twitter where he posts some tutorials that he does for cool materials and other things. And I'm going to link to that in the description below. He also posted a tweet where he did his own take on this effect, and it looks super cool, and he did a really nice stained glass texture. I'm going to go much simpler on my texture. He also does assets for the Unreal Engine Marketplace, and he's done some super cool space assets. If you're doing a space game, I'm going to link to that below. They are really cool, like orbits and asteroid fields and stuff. Perfect for a little indie game in space. So if you're interested, make sure to check that stuff out. Now moving on to the effect itself. We are going to be working on this depth faked stained glass floor, and I've got this YouTube video up here, just a random YouTube video that I searched up. And if we take a look at it, as Sora falls down here, we'll just kind of fast forward a little bit. So you can see as the camera moves in here, the surface little like metal line elements of the stained glass stand out, and it looks like there is a surface of glass on top here, and then there is stuff below the surface. So as it pans in here, you can see this looks like it is down below the surface. And there are also some ancillary effects like distortion from glass and stuff like that. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot that goes into this effect to make it look like there is depth here. You could also do this by simply having a plane that's translucent and then having another plane below it with a texture on it. Super easy way to do this that doesn't take into account all this stuff. But if you wanted to do this in one material, a little bit simpler, then that is what we're going to tackle here. So, there are a couple different parts to this effect that we'll notice. Like you can see, these lines have either they actually do have depth, or this is a faked depth effect where they take multiple samples of this line and push them deeper and deeper looking so that it gives you a 3D effect. And then also you notice that this surface down here looks pretty deep. So it looks like it's further below everything else. And then once we're standing still, you can see that this texture is also panning to really sell that depth. And that is the effect that we're going to be working on. So we're just going to jump right over in Unreal Engine 4 and start working on it. So as usual, I just have a third person blueprint here, which is going to be perfect for showing this off. We are also going to create some folders here just to get things going. So we'll have a materials folder, and in that materials folder we'll have a texture folder because we're going to have a few textures here that are going to be used in this effect. So the first one that we're going to use is in Photoshop, and oh, that's the wrong texture. So you can see I have a simple Donald Duck portrait that I made. I actually used this image as reference and just made a simple out of shapes vector art kind of image in Photoshop. And so we have the RGB. Then aside from the RGB, we also have, oh, that's not, okay. Aside from the RGB, we also have a black and white mask of this that we're going to use to separate a lot of the effects out. So then I'm saving that as a targa because it has an independent alpha channel, unlike PNGs. We can use this independent alpha channel to shove this mask in here and then use that for the effect. So we're going to take that and put it into our texture folder. So Donald Duck TGA. So now we have that in here. We'll take a look at it. Looks pretty good. We're knocking out those lines because we have this alpha in here that's telling it there's nothing there, but we're going to separate that out. We also want to remove maps because we just want this to look good from a distance. We're not super worried about performance here because it's just a single image that we're going to be directly on top of. So the very first thing that we're going to do here is create a material out of this, and we're going to call this M stained glass. And we're going to move that back to our materials folder. Now we open this up, we got the color feeding right in there. We're going to change this a little bit though. We want a couple things here. So we want to have an emissive, and we're going to want to be able to control that emissive with a scalar parameter. We're going to call that emissive brightness. And the reason we're doing this is if we take another look at this effect, you see that there's like this bright bloom coming out of the surface that makes it look like there's light shining up through the stained glass. So we are going to hop in here. We've got the emissive now. We also want to have roughness to kind of differentiate the aspects of the surface, so the metal from the glass. So we're going to plug in the alpha into this lerp, and where it is black, which is where the lines are, we want it to be semi-rough. So we're going to give that 0.4, and where there's the glass, we want it to be pretty smooth. So we're going to give that 0.05. So now, if I look at this, you can see that we have differentiation between those two elements. We have solid, kind of rough lines, and then glass in center. So that's a good start. But we need to do some things here to make this look a little bit more interesting. So the very first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start faking the depth in this image. And the way we're going to do that is a node called the bump offset node. So essentially what this is doing is creating offset UVs to make this look like it is pushed in or pulled out of the texture. So, or the material itself, the surface of the material. So we've got this bump offset. What we want to do is create a couple scalar parameters. One will be height, and the other will be height ratio. So we're going to plug these in. We're going to give them some default values. So 0.2. One of these days I'll be able to type 0.2. And 0.03 for the height ratio. So we've got that now. And we've got that plugged in. So we're going to take a look at what this does. So to do that, we're going to create a material instance. And we're going to open that up. And you see we've got our brightness. We can crank the brightness up. We've got our height. We can use that. So if we pull out here to positive values, you can see that it looks like the texture is offset from the surface of the object that has the material on it. So it kind of looks like it's coming out at you like 3D glasses back in the day. If you push this value in to a negative value, it then starts to look like it's below the surface. So you can see there's a neat effect where it looks like it's pushed into the surface of the object. And if we reset that and do the height ratio, you can see it's essentially doing the same thing in reverse. What we're going to use that for is to scale the effect. So we're just scaling how much the height ratio is affecting the height. But these two values are pretty decent. And we're not going to see too much here just doing it this way, but I just wanted to show you how that worked. And the way that we're going to do this is we're actually going to take this away from that, because this is going to be our surface texture. So the lines here are going to be exactly where they need to be. And then we're going to take some more samples of this texture to make it look like it is pushed down deeper, to give us a 3D effect to it. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to duplicate this 3 times because we want to have 4 different samples. And then we're going to duplicate this 2 times because we're only offsetting 3 of those samples. We're going to make the height ratio the same for all of them. But then we are going to make different constants for these 2 and then give them depth. So we're going to go negative 0.1 actually, and then we're going to go negative 0.3 for this other one. So now we've got these, we can plug them directly into our UVs, and you can see we've got that going. Now we need to combine these in a way. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to multiply all these together. We actually drag this out a little bit to give ourselves some space. We're going to multiply these together because we want to create a mask. And if we multiply all these together, since we're going to be using the alpha values, the black parts of the image are going to take out the white parts of the image, so that you have a mask of all these different offsets. And you may be wondering why we're using this one in this multiplication, because we're going to be plugging this into the base color at some point, which would handle that. But we're also going to use this as a mask for the metallicness to give these black lines a little bit of a metallic look. So we want to include this portion of the surface portion of the mask in there as well. So we're just going to multiply these all by each other. So make a couple different multiply nodes, make sure they're all going into the right places. So we have all these together. Now we want to make another multiply, and then we're going to multiply this by the base color so that we're getting the color back into this. And then again, I'm going to need probably a little bit more space. Maybe I can just move these. Yeah, so that works. So we want this to be plugged in everywhere. We had the color plugged in before, so into this multiply for the emissive and into the base color. And then this multiply is going to go into a lerp. So this is before we add the color in. We're just going to make this the alpha, and we're going to say that we have a value of 0.5 for metallicness for all the black areas and a value of 0 for all the white areas. And then we're going to plug that into metallic. So now, if we take a look, we'll just take a look in the instance because it's larger and easier to see. You can see that we've got a fake depth effect going on for these black lines that make them look a little 3D. You can notice at some edges like these, it'll look a little funky. If you added more samples and reduced the distance between them, it would look a little bit better, but I think this looks fine. If you looked at the Kingdom Hearts effect, it actually has like a bunch of different lines going on down there below each of these things because they're using, you know, a sample count, not super thick lines. They're using thin lines. If you want that kind of layered effect, you would want to use thinner lines, more samples, more distance kind of thing. But I am pretty happy with the way this looks. So we've got, you know, if I can get catch the light here, you can see that we have a very reflective glassy surface. We have a more diffuse rough metallic surface, and then we have some depth faking going on. So we are off to a great start here. What we're going to do is we're going to comment this and call it depth faking for surface So we've got that there, and we can probably clean this up a little bit because it is getting a little messy. We want this lerp to be further down, this one here, so that's a little bit better. So the next thing we want to do, now that we have depth faking on the surface of this object, we want to have something that's pushed deeper. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a texture, and you saw this texture a little while ago when I goofed up and had it up before. It's just a grass texture that I got from Substance Painter that I used in a previous project. We don't really want it to look like glass. Look like grass. If you look at Kingdom Hearts, they have this kind of cool, like, liney, webby thing with a bunch of, like, spatters. It's very interesting texture. We're not quite going to go for that, but we do want something that's kind of like ethereal and just looks like this weird, like, sparkly texture. So the way that I'm going to tackle this is using this grass texture. And I'm just going to drag this in here. Pitch grass base color. And same deal as before, I'm going to turn off the mip-maps because the further we get away from this, if we have mip-maps on, all of this detail is just totally going to disappear. And we don't want that. We want to be able to see that. So we're going to save that. Now we're going to drag this into our material. And the first thing we want to do is just drag off and make sure we're getting a grayscale portion of this image. We don't want the color. And we want to add this, or sorry, multiply this times our color that's going in. So if I just grab this, plug it into a multiply, and then I also want this to go in where, like, before the color, right? So we're going to plug that into there, and then we're going to plug this everywhere the color was going. So now, if we take a look at it, we've got our grass. We don't want it to look like grass, so we're going to change some of that, but it's in there, and we've got a little background. So we want to make this a little bit less noisy, so we're going to do some things to this image. We're going to get a cheap contrast. We're going to plug this in, and we're going to get a scalar parameter and call this texture contrast. We're going to plug that in, and then we're going to change that in the instance that we have up here, but we're going to plug that into this add node, and we're going to give it a baseline of 0.1. And essentially what that's doing is, if we use this contrast to get rid of a lot of this detail, we'd have a lot of black areas, and then we'd be multiplying that against the color and losing all the color. And we don't want to lose the color, we want to keep that. So we're going to add 0.1 to give it a base level of color. And you can parameterize that too. I'm not going to do that here, but you could do it to make it brighter if you wanted to, but I'm just going to keep it the way it is. So we are going to save that. And then we're going to take a look at the instance. And then now we're going to tinker with this a little bit. So we're going to pump this up, and you can see we're starting to lose some of that detail, which is exactly what we wanted. And I think around 2.5-ish looks like it's pretty good. It gives you like a little sparkly effect. Now the image is a little bit darker, so we want to bump up this brightness, and maybe too much. Let's go 4.5. 4.5 looks pretty good. So we're going to save that. And we're just going to input those values in here so we can see that while we're working on our texture. 2.5 here for the contrast, and 4.5 for the emissive brightness. So now you can see that looks good. It looks kind of sparkly. And we can look at this in the editor just to see what we're doing here and what we need to change. So we're going to make this, we're going to drag a cube out. We're going to make it huge. And then we're going to get our material instance and throw that on there. And now we need to get our pawn. Where have I put the pawn? Oh, he's already in the air. So we're going to drag that up onto the surface. And now we can walk around and look at it. So you can see as we walk around here, it's static. It's not moving. So we're gonna want to change that. I mean, if you look at if you walk around and look at the depth faking on the metal lines, It looks like it kind of moves around those, but when you're over here, it's not moving at all. It's just a static image, and that is not what we want. We want it to look like it's down below the surface and moving at a different rate than everything on the surface. So we go back to the texture, and the first thing we could try to do here is we could try to use this bump offset, plug it directly into the UVs, give it the same height ratio, but make it look deep, make it look really deep. So we're going to give it -10, and we're going to see what that does. So now you can see it does give it depth. However, there is a trade-off there. And I don't exactly know how the bump offset does its magic, but it looks to me like there's some kind of radial gradient or sphere mask that's being used to distort the texture. And so as you move, it distorts and it kind of rolls. And that's not what we want. We want it to look like it's a plane that is just beneath the surface. So we're not going to use that here. And honestly, if you look at what it's doing to the black lines as well, if you get real close, you can see it's also distorting it in the same way, but you really don't notice that too much as you're just running around here. But it's super noticeable in this background texture. So we're going to do this a different way. We're going to use the actor position in world space and the camera position in world space, and we're going to use these to get a movement vector. So these are both Vec3's, so we're going to need to break out float 2 components to get the X and the Y. We're going to do that for both of them. Oh man, what am I doing? Oh, I hate that. I hate how sometimes these lines get a little kinked. We're going to append these into a single vector that we're going to use to get a motion vector to then offset the texture coordinates. So we get another append vector. And we are going to subtract one from the other to get our motion vector. And then we are going to divide this because this is in a world space and it is a super huge value by comparison to texture space. So we're going to divide this by a huge number, like 5,000. We're going to pull this back a little bit, and then now we want to add this to our texture coordinates. So actually we're going to need a texture coordinate node as well. So we've got the texture coordinate, plug that in, and now if we take a look at it, we've got a different effect. Much more like what we want here. Let this compile, and now you can see it looks like the surface is pushed down because it's kind of panning with our direction of movement slowly, but not as fast as we're moving. So it just looks like it's moving at a slower rate than the lines on the surface. And this effect isn't perfect. There are some issues with it based on how this is set up. Like when we jump, it kind of pushes down a little bit, but that gives you kind of a trippy sense of vertigo, which I kind of like here. If you move the camera down, everything seems to get flat. And that happens with bump offset. It happens with this method we're using. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're standing on a surface like this where you fake depth. It can look pretty flat if you get pretty close to the surface. But we're going to do some things to kind of offset that, mitigate that, so it looks pretty decent even if we get close to parallel with the surface. So we've got that now. One other thing we want to do here real quick is if I go back here, and if we're standing still in this footage, you can see that the texture is also panning, and that helps because if we go back and we look at the pawn and we look at them standing on the surface, all illusion of depth disappears when they're just standing on the surface because you can't tell that it's even faking depth other than those lines. So it just looks like you're standing on the surface when you're walking here, and then when you step over here, it looks like you're not standing on that background texture. So we want to give a little bit of motion to it so that we're constantly getting that fake depth effect. So we're going to grab a, not a 1-. We're going to grab a panner, and we're going to plug the texture coordinates in there. We're going to replace that in that add. We're going to get a time node, and we're going to plug the time node in, and we're going to change the speed on both the X and the Y to 0.001 to give a really subtle movement, really slow movement. So now you can see it's moving. If we stand on it, we still have that depth effect because the object is moving, or because the texture on the bottom of the object is moving. It's still not perfect. Sometimes if you've got no frame of reference here, it looks like you're just standing on a surface that's moving under you, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we're going to do some other things in a few minutes to kind of offset that, to make it always look like it's a little bit deeper. The other thing you'll notice is that these lines here, although the material attributes look different, they don't appear to be offset at all from the glass, and we want there to be sort of a height differential there. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add normals in here. But first, let's cordon this off and call this depth faking under glass. So we've got that now. Now for normals, there are a couple different things we could do. If we just want to do one texture for this whole thing, what we can do is go normal from height map and get that node, and then get it. Well, actually, let's just delete one of these, or delete that and get one of these texture samples we already had. And you'll notice if you try and pull off this node and put it into the height map, it's not going to take it because it's got this texture 2D thing, and that's basically saying it wants a texture object. And this is not a texture object. So this presents a little bit of trouble because we can't just grab our mask from the alpha channel and plug it in here. You would need a separate texture, because once you convert this to a texture object, you can't pull off of individual channels. You basically just plug this right in. So you could do a couple different things here. You could import a separate texture mask that you could then use, but that adds another texture to the mix. There's also a normal from function that you can use and then offset a single texture, and there's a bunch that goes into that, but I've tried it. It doesn't look quite as good as just doing this, but I did happen to try this and just plug this texture object straight in, and you wouldn't think this would work that well because it's not really a height map. It's got colors and such, but we've got pretty sharp, solid black lines, and then we've got color values. So essentially, it's still going to act as a height map. It's just not going to be perfect. We're also going to want to plug in for intensity here and give this -3 because our black values are actually the ones that we want to raise. And then we want to change this offset, height map UV offset. And basically what this does is this controls the spread on the slope for these lines. So the larger a value you give it, the more slope there is on the lines and the height. The smaller value, the sharper that line is. And we want it to be fairly sharp. So now we've got this, and if we drag off of it and get a multiply node, we can take a look at what it looks like. We can start previewing it. And you can see we've got normals there, and they look all right. Not perfect, but they'll get the job done. So we'll plug these in and take a look at what it looks like. I should stop previewing that. Okay, so now let's take a look. So you see we have normals now. We've got a little bit of fake height on there. The normals are pretty decent. They're a little jagged around the edges. If you used a separate texture mask, you can get a better result from this. But it doesn't look terrible. So if you just want something really cheap, you could do that. I want something that looks a little bit nicer here, though. And if we're gonna bring in another texture as a mask to use in this height map, instead of doing that, we might as well just bring in normals that we've made elsewhere that will look exactly how we want them to, and also cut down on these instructions that we're going to be doing. So the way I did this was I used Substance Designer, as I typically like to use for Substance Designer for all kinds of textures and effects that I make. Substance Designer is pretty decent for making normal maps. It might not be as robust as some of these programs that just make normal maps, but you can also do a lot of different operations to the image before the normal or to the normal after, using all these nodes that you would use for other types of images. So what I've done here is I've brought in that mask, just black and white, and I plugged it directly into the normal. So if we take a look here, you can see it's offset in the way we want it to be. Got a pretty decent looking image. The problem is it's really jaggy, really aliased. We don't want that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to blur it. And if you blur it really softly, you can get rid of a lot of that trouble that we had there. And I have it at a value of 0.2 here. If you do it at higher values, you get more of a slope. So the more you blur it, the more sloped it's going to look, the more it's kind of like that height map UV offset in the normal function in Unreal. Gives it more of a slope, but it makes it look super smooth. So we don't really want it to be that spread out. We want it to be still pretty sharp, but not aliased. So we're going to kind of compromise on that. And then you plug into an output, and then you come up here, and then you can export as bitmap and choose what type of image. I'm just using a Targa once again for consistency's sake in this effect. So now we're going to bring that into Unreal. So I have Donald Duck normal output here, and I'm going to drag that into the texture folder. So now we take a look at that. Looks great. I'm going to turn off the MIP maps again. If this is the wrong way around for you, you can flip the green channel. But we want it to look like it's popping out, not sinking in, so this looks perfect. And we can click compress without alpha here because we don't need the alpha for this. I don't believe it had an alpha already, but just in case we can click that to save ourselves some space in the long run. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to drag this in to the material and plug it right in. And we're going to delete this other stuff, and we will take a look at what this looks like. So now, if we take a look, we've got pretty nice effect, and you can balance that however you want with the jaggies versus the slope, but I think this is a pretty good balance. It gives us some clean lines, it gives us a decent height effect, and not too many compromises on either side. It's a little bit more expensive, but I think it is worthwhile for this effect. So now you can see it kind of looks like that's coming out of the glass a little bit, and it looks pretty good. So that's one of the things that we're going to do here to add a little bit more depth to this. One of the other things is we're going to add some detail to this glass surface so that it looks like you're standing on a surface instead of just like a plane that this texture is under. Because if it looks like there are two different surfaces and one's moving and one is not, then you can definitely tell that there's some depth there. And they do this also in the Kingdom Hearts effect, where, as I noted before, they have distortion when things move under the glass, and they also have a little bit of dirt that's pretty hard to see because there's a lot of bloom here from this emissive. But we're going to do both of those to really shore this effect up and make it look a little bit nicer. So the first thing we want to do is get a texture coordinate, or texture sample, not texture coordinate, and we want to get low res blurred noise. And I believe I've used this before in one of these tutorials, but this is just engine content that is pretty useful for doing a lot of different effects. I'm going to get a texture coordinate for this, and I'm going to tile the hell out of this, so it's going to be 200 by 200. I don't know how I got a 1 there. Plug that in. So now it's super fine grained, but it's also pretty bright, and we don't want the effect to be that pronounced. We want it to be pretty subtle. So we're gonna give it 0.001. So now if you look, it's much more dim. You might not even be able to see it, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely doing what we want it to do. So we're going to add this in to our texture coordinates for all these to kind of offset some of the pixels in various directions to make it look like it's being viewed through tempered glass. And what have I done here? Float 2, float 3. All right, yeah. So you want to use a grayscale portion of the image. We only want one channel. We don't want the whole color image. We just want the grayscale. And also, you can't multiply Effect 3 by Effect 2 in here. It freaks out, or add to them or anything. It's going to freak out on you. So you want to separate that out and then add that in. So we're going to add this effect into everything that's beneath the glass. So basically, everything that we want to be distorted is everything but this initial surface texture sample. So we're going to distort these 3 bump offsets up here as well, just before they're plugged into the texture coordinates. Plug all these in. Whoop. And one last one. So now, if we go take a look at this, we should have a very super subtle glass distortion effect. So now you can see as things move under here, they're kind of getting distorted a little bit. If you look here, there's a little bit of distortion of that as well. And just in general, as things move, there's a little bit of that twinkle of glass distortion. So that's the first thing that we'll do here. And you can notice already just that little bit of distortion kind of helps provide depth for the effect. And with the reflection and everything, it really starts to sell this effect. So we're just going to label this glass distortion. And we're going to add one more thing in here. So what we're going to do is get another texture sample, and we're going to get clean grunge. So clean floor grunge is a texture that's also in the engine content. And we don't want this whole color image once again. We just want to drag off of one of these component channels and subtract. So what we're doing, if you take a look at this, this is super bright and it's all across the entire image, and we don't want that. We want to reduce that so that we'll have mostly areas that are black and then a couple little specks. So the way that we're going to do that is subtract from it a little bit. Whoop, I added to it. Subtract from it a little bit so it gets darker. And then drag off of this and get a power node. And we're going to go to the power 3. And now if we look at this, it will be much darker. And we might not even, oh, you can kind of see it. So you can kind of see it's just like a very faint dust filter, which is exactly what we want. But we want to give it a little bit of color because we just don't want it to be white, look a little strange. So we're going to multiply it by color. And we're going to give it something in here. It's just like a little dirty color, something like that. So then we want to take this and move it where we can see what we're doing. And we're going to add this in to the base color. So we just want to overlay this on top of the base color. And you don't want this in the emissive. And you want to make sure you're keeping all your previous effects. So you want to make sure to drag off of this multiply, not this one up here. And this is exclusively going into the base color. But before we do that, we actually kind of want to add a little bit more to this dirt effect. We want it to affect the glass more and be less obvious on the lines, because it's going to be easier to see things on the metal lines and harder to see them on the glass surface. So what we're going to do here is not normalize. We're going to multiply by 0.5. So have a half of the intensity of the effect. And then we're going to lerp. So where the mask is black, which is, it's going to be this mask. Where this mask is black, it's going to be half intensity. And where it is white, it's going to be full intensity. And then we're just going to plug that into the base color. So we can probably throw that up there. Move this a little bit, and we're going to comment this and call it dirt. So now we're going to take a look at that, and hopefully I've done everything correctly. So you can see there is a little bit of dirt, not much on the black lines, just so they're not totally clean, but there's more out here. You can't really see it so much because it's a little, faint against what's supposed to be under it. But it does actually give the surface a little bit more weight and credibility. Meanwhile, you're not bogging down these black lines with a whole bunch of dirt. So if we find somewhere to stand where the dirt is obvious, So you can kind of see there's a very faint dirt here, and you might not be able to see it with YouTube compression and all that, but if you look at this in a project of your own, you can see it looks like he's standing on a surface and something is moving under him, and it really helps that depth persist. Even when you're super close down here, you can still tell that he is on a surface and that there is a surface below him moving, even if it looks a little bit flatter. So that is how we wanted to combat that that issue of looking a little bit flat. And I think we've done a pretty good job here of getting a bunch of different subtle parts to this effect to work together in concert to get a neat little fake depth effect. So now we run around here, and it looks like we're running on a surface, a glass surface with stuff moving below it, and there are these little 3D framework bits. If we take a look back at the Kingdom Hearts version of this, we can see that there's a lot more going on here. So they've done a lot more detail work. This is a much higher fidelity glass image that they're using that has a bunch of detail in it that, you know, the more detail that you pump into this, the more you'll be able to sell this effect, because there's more to look at and people won't focus so much on the parts of the image that stick out. So they've done some other things too, like they've masked off specific areas for more emissiveness. They've masked off other areas to be darker and less emissive, so you see less of what's going on under in both of these areas, and you get sort of a contrast and brightness that really makes this look like its own surface. The other thing they do here is you'll notice that there's sort of variable emissiveness in here. Some of this might be masks. Other parts of it actually change as you move. So if we watch when they start moving here, you'll notice that some of it actually changes when the camera moves around. You can see other areas and stuff like that. Some of this is done probably by masks, and other bits like this look like it fades off based on either a camera vector or distance from the camera. So you can kind of do some different things with that to give more of a volumetric effect to the surface, where it really sells that this is a surface and that there's a different surface under it. We're not going to go that deep. I'm pretty satisfied with this basic version of the effect here. We kind of understand the concept of faking the depth and of how or what the different things we can do are that will really make that look like it is deeper than it actually is. So based on that, I think we have a pretty decent effect. There are some limitations to it, as I mentioned before. If you're moving the camera sort of diagonal to the surface, it kind of pushes in. You can see that when you jump, it pushes in a little bit. It's not so bad there, but if the camera's moving like this, which hopefully it shouldn't in the game, you definitely wouldn't want to use this kind of effect if you're doing that. So that's a problem with it. Other than that, you know, like I mentioned numerous times, it gets flatter when you get closer to it. Also, because of how I've done this depth effect on the texture below it, if you come over to the side here, things do not work the same. So actually each different side is going to pan differently because of the way that this texture is set up. Some of them work right, some of them work horribly wrong. So how you set that up is going to depend on how you want to look at it. I just went for the same effect that they were doing, where it's a surface that you're walking on, so it looks really good from that angle and not good from other sides. If you wanted it to look good from every side, you might want to go with the bump offset, even with the distortion that it gives you, just because that does not care which direction you're looking at it from. It's agnostic of those directions. There might be a way that you can do it for all sides without using the bump offset. I'm sure there is a way. I do not know that off the top of my head, and just this was the quickest way that I could make this work. Another note, just in general, this looks better when you're perpendicular to it and just moving it at sort of shallow angles to the perpendicular to the normal of the surface. So, you know, my recommendation for this kind of effect is sort of if you had like a top-down game, and you wanted to have a background texture that looked like it had depth, or like a side scroller, something like that, then this would work really well for that type of application, and sort of less well when you have full 3D control of the camera like this. If I can pull in another project that I worked in here, this was what I first started messing around with this effect after seeing DeViver's tweet on the Kingdom Hearts glass, I started tinkering around with this texture that I made in Substance Designer of honeycombs to make sort of a 3D effect here. And if we look in the top-down space, this looks pretty good, actually. It gives a really convincing feeling of depth. We've got that same grass texture. We've also got the honeycomb texture, and I've got a noise from in-engine content that is creating sort of blood stains on the surface. I'm using that low-res blurred noise again for a glass distortion effect. And actually in this one I am using the bump offset for everything below the surface, which gives distortion when you're super close like this. But if you look up here, it is pretty good. You don't really notice the distortion once you get further away and you're sort of perpendicular to the surface. Even kind of at angles from a distance, it looks much better. So a couple things to note here is that shadows are not going to cast right on this. So if you're casting shadows down on the surface, it's going to look not so good. So if you can have light coming from behind the surface, it might work better because you wouldn't have shadows being cast on it, for instance. There are some other things I've done in here. So this is the blood effect up here. Mostly it's the same. This graph is a mess and it's not commented, but I've essentially just used the same mask for the whole thing. So just one texture in this one works really well for the normals here. The other thing that I've done is I've given this offset that you can add to this final layer that I'm basically making a shadow with. So you can see the shadow here, but you'll notice that it kind of doesn't make sense because it's basically assuming that the light is directly above the object, the center of the object, which is not going to always be the case. So what you can do with this is you can turn on these offsets, and then you can offset it to kind of set up the shadows here to be, you know, whatever they would be with your lighting situation. So that's just something that you can do with this effect to create some pretty interesting, neat materials that you can use to fake depth in the background of your game. You know, sky's the limit with this kind of depth faking. You can do a lot of different cool things. This is just one of the many. The stained glass is another. You could just do solid 3D objects in the back using this this depth faking. You could do all kinds of things, pillars, all kinds of neat stuff. So you know, it'd be interesting to see what you guys can create with this effect. And I hope you learned something from this. I hope you find this depth faking useful in your projects. If you have any questions about anything in this tutorial, put them down in the comments below, and I will try and get around to answering those when I can. If you have any suggestions for other effects that you would like to see broken down in this fashion, put them in the comments, and I will see if that's something that I want to get around to. I have a super long list of different effects that I want to do for the series. So look out for those videos in the future, because I will continue making videos in the series just kind of breaking down cool effects from games that you've probably played. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you have a great day.